Hello, thank you for joining. As part of the ERA and PICROGEN funded project, we have prepared short presentations with the main outputs from experimental trials. Research was done by the monogastric research group, and most of the trials were conducted at AFB Pig Farm in Hillsborough. For the current presentation, I'll be presenting myself. My name is Dr. Ramon Muns from the monogastric research group. And the presentation is wet and dry feeding to improve pigs performance. And this is part two, because we also produced another presentation on this topic, and this is the follow-up trials from that presentation. So from a previous trial that we conducted using wet and dry system in AFB pig farm, we identified that, or we observed that wet and dry feeding at a 2-to-1 ratio, 2 liters of water per 1 kilo of diet from weaning to 6 weeks of age increased feed intake and average daily gain and resulted in similar or the same feed conversion ratio than pigs fed dry feeding. Then changing at 6 weeks of age, changing the ratio from 2-to-1 to 3 liters of water per 1 kilo of diet and maintain it until 10 weeks of age. Also increased feed intake and average daily gain, and maintain the same feed conversion ratio than pigs fed dry. So after observing these results, we came up with two follow-up trials to do. One was a nursery trial in which we changed water to feed ratio over time, and then a finishing trial with finishing pigs to validate and compare wet and dry feeding with dry feeding of pigs. So I'm going to start with the trial at the nursery stage. The objective of this trial was to ease the transition from milk to solid food by starting the nursery stage at a high water to feed ratio, 3-to-1, and gradually decrease it at a different pace, trying to make the transition from this liquid feeding to the solid one rather than abrupt, to make it gradual and see if that would improve the performance of the animals. So here we have a picture of the wet and dry feeders that we have in our farm, in which we can see the central tube that delivers both the water and the diet separately but almost simultaneously in the feeder. So for this trial, we used 1,011 piglets. They were 28 days old at weaning, and from 8 different production batches. Pigs were housed in groups of 29. We had 4 treatments, so dry pigs, in which were offered dry feeding during all the nursery stage. Then we had wet 3-to-1, in which were offered a ratio of 3 liters of water per 1 kilo of diet all through the nursery stage, so from weaning to 10 weeks of age. Then we have the wet 3-to-1 and 1-to-1, in which pigs were offered initially a 3-to-1 ratio for 1 week, and then they were changed to a ratio of 1-to-1, 1 liter of water per 1 kilo of diet until the end of the trial. And the last treatment was wet 3-to-1, 2-to-1, and 1-to-1, in which pigs were offered a ratio of 3 liters of water per 1 kilo of diet for the first 2 weeks after weaning. Then they were changed to a ratio of 2-to-1 for 2 weeks, 6 to 8 weeks of age. And finally, the last 2 weeks of the trial, 8 to 10 weeks of age, pigs received a 1-to-1 ratio. All pigs were fed the same diets, 3 kilos per pig of a starter diet 1, followed by 6 kilos per pig of a starter diet 2, and then a grower diet until the end of the trial. Body weight was recorded individually at weaning, 6 and 10 weeks of age. Feed intake was recorded at the pen level. So here we have in this table the individual body weight and weight gain of piglets. We can see that all the wet treatments resulted in increased body weight at 6 and 10 weeks of age compared to the dry treatment. And subsequently, the average daily gain was the same. It was bigger for wet and dry treatments compared to the dry treatment. When we look at the results at the pen level, as expected, the average daily gain at the pen level is the same as we observed in the previous slide, wet and dry treatments having higher growth. The average daily feed intake was also higher in the wet and dry treatments compared to the pig's fed dry diet. And among wet and dry treatments, there were no differences on average daily gain or average daily feed intake. And finally, we found that in this case, feed conversion ratio was better in pigs fed the dry diet compared to pigs fed any of the wet and dry treatments. This is something that we didn't observe on the previous trial, on the part 1 presentation. So now I'm going to present the trial on the finishing pigs. The objective of this trial, because after we had the wet and dry system installed in the nursery stage in the AFP pig farm, we installed the same wet and dry system in 10 pens at the finishing site. So therefore, we designed this trial to validate the use of wet and dry feeding in finisher pigs and study its effect on growth performance as compared to dry feeding. For this trial performed in AFP Hillsborough, we used 260 pigs of 12 weeks of age from 2 different production batches. Pens were housed in groups of 15. We had 2 treatments, dry, in which pigs were offered dry feed, or wet 3-to-1, in which pigs were offered a ratio of 3 liters of water for 1 kilo of diet. Here we have the detail of the wet and dry feeders that we have in our finishing site. You can see they are similar to the ones in the nursery site, but as a different size to accommodate the higher volumes that they have to be administered. So all pigs were fed the same diets. So before the start of the trial, so from 10 to 12 weeks of age, they all received the same grower diet. And then at 12 weeks of age, when the trial started, they all received a finisher diet. Body weight was recorded individually at 12, 17, and 22 weeks of age. Feed intake was recorded at the pen level. And then we also measured lesion score and dirtiness score. Because with using this wet and dry system, we wanted to see if there was more lesions, possibly due to competition maybe at the feeder, and then also dirtiness, because with this kind of liquid wet and dry feeding could result in more animals becoming more dirtier, or even the pen becoming dirtier, which can be an issue in the farm related with health issues maybe. So here the results. We can see the individual pigs' body weight and growth, and also the lesion and dirtiness score of individual pigs. So body weight at 12 and 17 weeks of age did not differ between treatments. However, at 22 weeks of age, the pigs fed dry were 2 kilos heavier than pigs fed wet and dry. Numerically, it's only 2 kilos, but it came up statistically significant. The average daily gain, similarly, from 17 to 22 weeks of age, and overall from 12 to 22 weeks of age, it was slightly higher in pigs fed dry diets. Numerically, It's a very small difference, but it came up statistically significant. When we look at the Lesion score consisted on counting the number of scratches and wounds at on the body of each pig, and then based on the final number, it would result on a score from 0 to 3. And in this case, there were no differences and very low, almost no lesions at 12 and 17 weeks in both treatments. But when we look at 22 weeks of age, when the animals are bigger and it's more likely to be higher fights or competence for access to the feed, we see that the wet and dry treatment, they had a higher lesion score. They presented more wounds. So we consider that this could be a higher fights to access the food. When we look at the pen level, the performance and also the dirtiness score, we can see that average daily feed intake, there was no difference between treatments, and feed conversion ratio, there was also no difference between treatments. So wet and dry system perform at the same efficiency as the pigs fed dry. And when we look at the pen dirtiness, while we saw in the previous slide that the dirtiness at the body level, so the proportion of the body that was covered or in soilage or mud or feces did not differ between treatments when looking at the pigs. But when looking at the pen level, pens fed wet and dry were dirtier, where they were wetter and dirtier than pens fed dry diet. So the concluding remarks on the two trials is that the wet and dry feeding, starting with a ratio of 3:1 at weaning, and then decreasing, improved weight gain and feed intake of pigs, but presented worse feed conversion ratio than dry diets, than pigs fed dry diets. Wet and dry feeding after weaning improves average daily gain, average daily feed intake, and body weight during the nursery stage, irrespective of the ratio and also irrespective of whether we change this ratio over time or not. Wet and dry feeding at a 2:1 ratio for the first 2 weeks after weaning, and then changing to a ratio of 3:1 results, of a ratio of 3:1 results in a similar feed conversion ratio than dry feeding. And this is something that we observed on the first trial we did on part 1, on presentation part 1. Wet and dry feeding in finisher pigs using a 3:1 ratio doesn't improve growth or feed intake of pigs, but it produces the same feed conversion ratio than pigs fed dry feeding. So we don't observe these improvements on feed intake and weight gain as we see in the nursery stage, but it produces the same feed conversion ratio as dry feeding. So wet and dry feeding has high potential, in my opinion, to improve farm's performance, especially when used in the nursery stage. And the water to feed ratio is a key element to consider in the nursery stage. Studies using different diets and or co-products might result in further benefits of using the wet and dry feeding system, but this remains to be studied. And finally, I would like to acknowledge the ERA and PictoGen funding and co-funding of this project and this trial, and also a big thank you to the AFB Hillsborough pig team for making possible these trials, and also thank you to CL, because the wet and dry feeding system installed at the finishing site was installed with CL investment. And thank you for listening.